Um, so today's daf in Masechet Chullin, citing continuation of the sugya of Giran Nasheh, which is the mission that we had yesterday, and getting into all the questions which we're actually going to build on today of how one isser on an animal or on anything actually can add additional isurim. So the question of isser chal al isser. And so yesterday we talked about a non-kosher animal, behemat me'ah, and whether if you eat the gid of that behemat tme'ah, you're chayiv for gid hanasheh. And there was a machloket. Rabbi Yehuda said you're chayiv twice for eating behemat tme'ah and gid hanasheh. And we asked, what about Rabbi Meir? I'm sorry, Rabbi Yehuda. I said Rabbi Yehuda holds ein isur chal al isur, but still, this case, the isur is the second isur of gid hanasheh does come on the isur of behemat tme'ah because it's an isur with more chumrah. It adds more stringencies, and it doesn't add actually more stringencies, but it adds more people. So that because the Isser of Gid HaNasheh applies universally, so when this Gid forms, it becomes Asr from Gid HaNasheh to non-Jews, so B'nai Noach, and therefore there's also, it applies that Avera or that prohibition to Jews as well. That was the answer yesterday. Now, it says more 2 lines in the bottom of Kuf Amabet Gufa. Let's go back and quote the Braita that started this off. Ochel Gid HaNasheh shel behemat tme'ah. A person who eats a gid hanasheh of a non-kosher animal, Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv shtayim, which as I just explained, but Rabbi Shimon says you're putter completely. You ate this gid hanasheh, you are not chayiv for anything. Ask Gemara, why not? Rabbi Shimon manavshach. According to Rabbi Shimon, which way are you leaning? Meaning, what do you think about whether isur chal al isur, right? Isur chal al isur. If a second isur can fall on a first one, then you should be chayiv for two. You should be chayiv for eating the lion, and you should be chayiv for eating a chayiv nami mishum gid. So what are you going to say? Ein isur chal isur, presumably is what he holds. The second isur of gid hanasheh does not apply, but you should be chayiv for the first isur, the chayiv mishum tumad dikadim. You should be chayiv at least because it's a non-kosher animal, and as we said yesterday, that was first in the sense that the identity of the animal was considered to be a lion before the gid was formed, but there should at least be one isur. Of course, the obvious answer is, well, gid is not food, right? So if gid is not food, then eating it is not chai for eating a lion. You're eating like a piece of wood. So aim begidin benotein tam. So if the reason Rabbi Shimon says you're patur is because he holds that gidim don't have taste and therefore it's not a foodstuff, and so you're not chayav. But then again, if it's not an animal, right, a behemat tme'ah, it should be a gid hanasheh, like in a cow, which is also aim begidim the notein tam. But the Torah gives you some knowledge that there's an additional prohibition of a gid. So fourth line from the top, aim begidim and notein tam, and therefore that's why you're not chayiv for eating it as an animal, but chayiv mishum gid. You should be chayiv because of a gid, because the whole point of gid hanasheh, according to that Tana, is that although it's not food, the Torah says you're not allowed to eat it. Amar Rava, says Rava, okay, let me explain to you Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon holds Om Kasavar Ein Begidim Benotin Tam. Yeah, a gid is not part of the animal. So when you eat the gid of a lion, you're not eating a lion, you're not chayiv for eating behemat tme'ah. Why aren't you chayiv for gid hanasheh? Says Rava, because in fact, Rabbi Shimon darshans a pasuk. Shani hatam, there it's different. By gid hanasheh, damar kruk, because when the pasuk says, Al kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael gid hanasheh, the implication is don't eat the gid, meaning you can eat the rest of the animal, but refrain from this part of the animal. Misha gido asur, where the gid becomes asur, but bisaro mutar. Yatz tazu, that excludes a non-kosher animal where you couldn't go eat the meat, right? You couldn't eat the meat of the animal, and therefore the whole concept of gid hanasheh is a limiting concept, and don't eat the gid where you would have otherwise been able to eat the animal. But yatz tazu, Shegido asur, ubisara asur. Yeah, it excludes this one where if the mitzvah applied, which it doesn't, the gid would be asur and the meat would be asur because it's a non-kosher animal, and therefore there is no prohibition of gid hanasheh in that case. So the pasuk basically is explicitly saying a gid hanasheh only applies where you're allowed to eat the meat of that animal, and so that's Rabbi Shimon's opinion that there's no gid hanasheh by behemat tme'ah, and there's no meat by a gid. It's ein begidim benotin tam, and therefore you're not chayav for anything. That's the behemat tme'ah. The next case is, what about a behemat Torah, a kosher animal that is not kosher to eat because it's a nevela, right? So it says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda Marav, 10 lines from the top, if a person is ochel gid hanasheh shel nevela, you have an animal, kosher animal, a cow, that died. It wasn't shechted properly. It was a nevela. So this animal obviously cannot be eaten. It's an Isser nevela. What about the gid hanasha of that animal? Okay, so Rabbi Meir says you're chayiv twice, and we're going to go into this, of course, but that one Isser of eating nevela and one Isser of eating gid hanasha. So Isser is chal al Isser in this case, and we'll see why as we go. The Chachamim omrim eno chayav ela achat. The Chachamim say you're only chayiv one, and presumably, again, I'll speak out some of this. The Gemara will unpack this as we go. Presumably because the Isser of Nevela was there, but a second Isser of Gid Hanasheh is not chal on the first Isser of Gid of Nevela, and therefore there's only one prohibition. Now, we'll see if that's really the case, but that's what it seems like. You're only chayiv one time, there's no Isser chal Isser. But continues the Braita, Umodim Chachamim the Rabbi Meir, but the Chachamim who say you're only chayiv one, admit to Rabbi Meir that you'll be chayiv twice if you eat a Gid Hanasheh shel Ola. Gid Hanasheh shel Ola, Vishal Shar Niskal. If you eat the Gid Hanasheh of an animal that has been dedicated as an Ola, right, and then let's say shechted, so Yisrael is not allowed to eat it, or it was never shechted, whatever, or a Shar Niskal, which is, remember, an animal that wounds another animal, kills another animal, or kills a person, and that animal is condemned to be stoned. Both of those are situations where there's an Isser Hana'ah, right, where not only can you not eat it, but you're not allowed to use that meat for anything. And therefore, we'll see why, because there's an Isser Hana'ah of the second Isser, you would be Chayiv Shtayim. One for the Shar Niskal, let's say, and one for the Gid Hanasheh. Okay? Now, we'll see why. Why? So, Man Tai Tana, who is this Tana, the Chachamim, who say that Be'isser Kolel, right, when you have an Isser that adds more, what Kolel means, that it adds more parts of the thing, meaning you have a Gid Hanasheh, the animal's born, it's Gid Hanasheh is usher to eat. It's never going to become mutar. When the animal drops dead and becomes a nevela, not only is the Gid usher to eat, but the whole animal is usher to eat now. So that's an Isser Kolel. So the Chachamim say it doesn't matter, the fact that it adds more aspects, the fact that this Gid is not any different. You couldn't eat the Gid before, you can't eat the Gid now, you didn't add any Isurim, so therefore the second Isser of nevela does not chal on the Isser of Gid Hanasheh. You only chayiv once, okay? But that's true by an Isser Kolel. It ain't Isser Chalal Isur. Where am I? The Isser Kolel Isser. Where am I? Right. Sorry, let me read it. The Gears is a little confused. The Isser Kolel, when you're talking about an Isser that adds more parts, but nothing to this part, Isser Chal al Isser Letle, right? Isser Kolel. You don't hold of Isser Chal al Isser. So the second Isser of Nevela is not Chal on the Isser of Gid Hanasheh. But be Isur Chamor, if the second Isur, such as Shar Niskal or Ola, is a stricter Isur on the same thing, meaning this piece of meat or this piece of Gid was Asur for Gid Hanasheh, and now it's also Asur B'Hana'ah, so there, Itle, they do hold an Isur Chal Isur, and if you eat it, you'll be Chayiv twice. So who is that Tana, which clearly is the opinion of the Rabbanan? Amar Rava, says Rava, well, by inference, we're going to learn that it's Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We're going to say that it's Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We're going to see this is not a direct quote from Rabbi Yossi Aglili, but it's an inference from Rabbi Yossi Aglili from the following case. It's not. There's a Mishnah that we had that talks about a person who is tamei, right? We learned it's the end of Zvachim. Remember, the halacha is that if a karban becomes tamei, the meat is tamei, you're not allowed to eat it. But it's not an isser, it's an isser lo taseh. If a person is tamei, and they eat a karban that's tahar, then they're chayiv not only a lo taseh, they're chayiv karet, right? So it's a much stricter isser if the person is tamei shachal tahar, as opposed to a tahar shachal tamei, right? You got that right. So neither way can you eat it, but it's more strict, and therefore you bring a karban and you be chayiv karet if the person was tamei, okay? So says the Mishnah, what if both are the case? What if the person's tamei and the food is tamei? So again, let's be very clear. If the person is tamei and they eat kachim that's tahar, they're chayiv karet. It's a more serious isser, and they bring a karban. If the meat is tamei and the person is tahar, then it's just an isser lo taseh, but it's not as strict. Okay, so says the Mishnah, tamei, a person who's tamei, sha'achal kodesh, who ate karban, bein kodesh tamei, bein kodesh tahar chayav. Whether you eat kodesh that is tamei, or you eat kodesh that's tahar when you touch it and put it in your mouth, you'd be chayav, okay? Because The fact that the person is tamei is what's critical. And it doesn't matter if the meat was tamei or tahar. The person who's tamei is over an isser karet, and you'd have to bring a karban if you did it b'shovin. Reb Yossi Aglili says, I disagree. Tamei sha'achal tahar. Look, if a person who's tamei ate a piece of meat that's tahar, of karban, then you're chayav. That's the classic case. I agree with you. You're chayav a karban if you do it b'shogeg. But tamei sha'achal tamei patur. A person who is tamei, who eats a piece of karban that itself is tamei, would be patur from a karban. Shelo achal el tavar tamei. Because he, and again, we don't know what these words mean right now, but a person would just be, because he only ate a davar tamei, right? And again, we're going to speak this all out. It's very confusing. But the point here is that if, assuming that the meat was tamei first, when the human being became tamei, he didn't get a new status that, oh, I can't eat this meat on bichayv karet, because he already couldn't eat the meat, because it was already tamei. So that was what Rabbi Yossi says, which we'll see is very similar, that he holds ein isur chalal isur for a davar that's kolel, right? Because obviously when the person becomes tamei, he not only cannot eat this piece of meat, which is tamei, he can't eat any piece of meat from karban. But this piece of meat didn't change, and therefore, says Rabbi Yossi Aglili, it doesn't get a second isur, it doesn't get a stricter isur of isur karet, or karban. Now, let's finish the Braita. Amrulo, so the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that makes no sense. According to your logic, if the only time a person who's tamei is chayav for eating kachim is if they eat a piece of kachim that's tahar, then every single time a person who's tamei touches a piece of kachim to eat it, they're going to make it tamei, right? Amrulo av tamei shachal tahar. So too, if your person's tamei and they eat a karban that's tahar, well, it doesn't stay tahar for very long. Once you touch it, you made it tamei. So there's no such thing as a tahar shachal, tamei shachal tahar. Mulo. So asking about Shapir Kamrele Rabbanan Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Well, before we go into detail of what Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds, this seems like a very good point of the Rabbanan, that how in the world do you ever have a tahar shachal tamei? Right? So how do you explain that? Says the Gemara, well, he's got an easy answer. Amar Rava, take out the vav, right? Says Rava, well, the issue here is not whether the meat is tamei or not. The question here is, which isser came first, right? Because the whole point of isser chal isser is what reality exists and what do we add to that reality. Says Rava, the issue here is b'nitzma guf. If Reuven becomes tamei, then the moment Reuven becomes tamei, he is prohibited on eating any karban which is not allowed to be eaten betuma, right? And if he eats that, he's chayav karet. The fact that then the piece of meat became tamei does not change the isurim. B'nitzma guf, if the person Reuven becomes tamei, v'achar kach nitma basar, and then the meat becomes tamei, and then he eats it. Kuli amalo pligi dechayav. Everyone, even Rabbi Yossi Aglili, admits that you're chayav a karban because the first isser was the man becoming tamei, and that's an isser karet. The isser karet kadim. The prohibition, don't eat this meat, and if you eat it, you're chayav karet, that came first. Ki pligi, where they argue, where there's going to be a machloket between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi Aglili, is where the meat became tamei first. Nitzma basar. So at the moment the meat became tamei, the person who's tahar can't eat that meat because it's tuma meat, but he's only chayav a lotase, not a karban. And then he became tamei. V'achar kach nitzma haguf. And then the person became tamei, right? So like I said, that's an isser kolel, because now not only can he not eat this piece of meat that's tamei, he can't eat any pieces of meat. So Rabbanan are of the opinion that Isser Kolel, it's an Isser that includes more things. The person becoming Tamei can now not eat anything. And Migu Demechayev Chatichat Tohorot Da'alma, since now Reuven who's Tamei can not eat and would be Chayev Karet, or Karban, for eating other pieces of Ola, he would also have a status of Isser of Karet and Karban for a Chaticha that's Tme'ah, that was previously Tamei. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, I disagree with that. Let lay Isser Kolel. I don't have an Isser Kolel. Demigo lo amrinan. I don't say that since this person becoming Tamei means that he now can't eat other things, he also can't eat this thing. I don't say that. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you see clearly from this Braita, holds that that there is no Isser Chal Isser when it's an Isser Kolel. So even though, going back now to our case of Nevela, even though the Gid Nasheh alone was Asur, once the animal died and became a Nevela, the whole animal became Asur. According to the Chachamim, that's fine. Isser Chal Isser in that case, because the Isser of the whole animal includes the Isser of the Gid Nasheh. According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that's not enough. Because since the prohibition on the Gid Nasheh in that case, or on the Tameh in this case, did not change the nature of the Tumah, meaning you couldn't eat it before, you can't eat it now, it doesn't add. The only place where Rabbi Yossi Glili might admit, which he doesn't say in this Braita, but the only Mishnah, the only place where Rabbi Yossi Glili might admit that Isser Chal Isser is where it's an Isser that's Mosif, where it adds prohibitions, right? Meaning an Isser of Hana'ah, then he says, okay, if you add an Isser Hana'ah, then that might be Chal, and you be Chayiv twice. But here, it only added the same Isser, don't eat it, and since it added the same Isser of don't eat it, it doesn't add a second prohibition. Okay, I'll ask the Gemara, but it's not so true. But Rabbi Yossi Aglili, I understand the Isser Kolel Letle Isser Kal, right? I understand that Rabbi Yossi Aglili would say that there's an Isser Kal, and I'll translate this as a light or equivalent Isser, is not added to it. So the fact that the meat was tamei mean that you couldn't eat it. The person became tamei, he still can't eat the meat, so there's no second Isser. But it is an Isser Chamor, right? Why don't you say Yavo Isser Chamor? The fact is that this actually is stricter. And Yichal Isser Kal. Why is this an Isser Chamor? Maininu Tumat HaGuf, right? What basically what happened here is that although you still can't eat it, the fact is that when a person becomes Tameh, right, they now have an Isser Karet, right? Yichol al Isser Kal. Maininu Tumat HaGuf, Shrei Tumat HaGuf Bekaret. Right? So says the Gemara, I hear you that Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds that an Isser that's kolel is not chal. But why isn't an Isser that's chamur chal? And the fact is that when a person becomes tamei tumat haguf, if they then eat kachim, they're chayiv karet. Why doesn't Rabbi Yossi Aglili say that the fact that although I couldn't eat, the Reuven couldn't eat this piece of meat because the piece of meat was tamei, but once Reuven becomes tamei himself, he now can't eat any kachim, and he's chayiv an isser karet for eating kachim. So why doesn't that be chal on top of this piece of meat? Says Rav Ashi, because your definition of tumat of isser is flexible. Says Rav Ashi, well, you're saying that that tumat haguf is more strict than tumat basar because tumat haguf is chayiv karet. But says Rav Ashi, you're right, that's true. But there are other differences between tumat basar and tumat haguf. Says Rav Ashi, 3 lines on the bottom, man leimelan tumat haguf chamura. Why are you so confident that tumat haguf is what's more chamur and that should be an isser that's halal isser? Dilma tumat basar chamura. Maybe we actually look at tumat basar in a more chamur way. Now, why? Because the letlei tahara b'mikvah. You remember, tumat haguf is very strict, but you can get rid of tumat haguf. You wait a few days, or if 1 day or 7 days, depending on your tumah, you jump into a mikvah, you're tahar. A piece of meat that becomes tamei can never become tahar, right? You can't purify, you can't drop meat in the mikvah. If you do, it's not tahar and it's dirty, right? So that certainly does not work. So therefore, it's true what you said about Isser of Karet, but how do you know that is a stricter Isser? Maybe it's not, and that's why Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds that if the meat was tamei first, there was an Isser on the meat. The fact that the person then became tamei and he can't eat any other meat in the world that's a karban does not change his status versus this meat, and he would be chayav for eating tamei meat, not for being a tamei person, and he wouldn't be chayav karet or have to bring a karban. So that is our explanation of that Mishnah in Tzvach. Turn the page to Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Bet. Ask the Gemara at the top now of Kuf Aleph, is it really true that Rabbi Yossi Aglili letle isur kolel? So you've just told me several times, right? The Rabbi Yossi Aglili is the Tana who holds that you don't add, if one isur is the same as another isur, right? And his case, of course, was meat that is tamei, and then a person became tamei, so they can't eat it for the same reason, you still can't eat it, that he is not chayiv a second time. So even though him becoming tamei adds the reality that he can't eat any meat in the world, or any kosher meat in the world. Is that true? There are basically letle isur kolel vatanya, but what about the following braita, which we love getting back to this? We've had this before, which is the question of Shabbat v'Yom Kippurim. Okay, which happens, right, frequently, not this year, but often Shabbat and Yom Kippur fall on the same day. right? So now, of course, you're not allowed to do a lot of things on Shabbat. You're not allowed to do a lot of things on Yom Kippur. For the most part, except very small exceptions, they overlap. So let's say a person, it's Shabbos Yom Kippur, and he's shagag v'asa melacha. He forgets that it's, let's assume, he forgets it's Shabbos and Yom Kippur, and he goes to his field and he starts working. And then he remembers. Ask the Braita, minayin shechayav al zeh ba'atzmo v'al zeh ba'atzmo. How do you know that you're chayiv two karbanot, right? You're chayiv for Yom Kippur, if you forgot Yom Kippur. You're chayiv for Shabbat. Talmud Lomar, therefore, the pasuk says, Shabbati v'yom HaKippurim hu. It says the word, a description of it, both by Shabbat and by Yom Kippur, to tell you that they have distinct and separate identities. Divrei Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. These are the words of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Now, we're going to finish the Braita first. We're going to ask that this seems to imply that the Kev Isser is Chal Isser, that Shabbat and Yom Kippur, one is Chal on the other, right? It's a little complicated because they're obviously at the same time, right? So Rashi says that seems to be an issue as well, that you'd only have to have one. Tosfos points out, and we're going to get this later in the Sugya, that definitely Shabbat is a fixed thing. Yom Kippur is depending on the calendar, right? So you know it's going to be Shabbat long before you know it's going to be Yom Kippur on this day when you use a calendar. But either way, what you see from here is Rabbi Yosef Glili holds your chayiv twice. Now it is based on a pasuk, but the point is that this pasuk should be teaching you that Isser Chalal Isser, right? So that's the first part of the Braita. Rabbi Akiva says, Eno chayiv ala achat, right? Says Rabbi Akiva, you're only chayiv once, and again, we don't yet know whether presumably it's Shabbat, which comes first. You're only chayiv once. So that is a Braita, which seems to contradict what you just said, right? Because you just said Rabbi Yosef Glili holds Ein Isur Chalal Isur, and here you have Shabbos and Yom Kippur, which are essentially equivalent, and we'll get into all these details. And Rabbi Yosef Glili says you're chayiv twice. Why would you be chayiv twice? So that's the question. Answers the Gemara, well, the truth is, it's a good question, but it's based on a mistaken assumption. Because Shalach Ravin, Mishum de Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, Ravin actually sent over a message, a writing, in the name of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, that you're right. The correct way, Kach Hatza'ah Shel Mishnah, the proper way to fix this Mishnah is ve'epoch, is to switch it around. Meaning this was a mistaken Mishnah. Right? The Mishnah really should have said that Rabbi Yosef Glili holds your chayiv 1, and Rabbi Akiva holds your chayiv 2. And so take this Mishnah and switch it around, and obviously that then makes everything work perfectly. Because now it is in fact Rabbi Yosef Glili's opinion that Ein Isur Chal Al Isur when you have equivalent Isurim. Okay, so that is how you'll have to explain the Mishnah. It says the Gemara, we're the first one on the line, 8 lines from the top. Shalach Rav Yitzchak Bar Yaakov Bar Giyuri Mishum Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rav Yitzchak Bar Yaakov Bar Giyuri sent another message, we're doing messages here, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and he said the following, L'divrei Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, according to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili in the Braita, now, of course, L'mayda Afchan, according to the one who switched it, right, meaning who came to what we just said, the Rabbi Yossi HaGlili really holds you only chayav once, right? So, because Ein Isur Chal Isur. Now, the question is, which one are you chayav? And let's say you knew about one but didn't know about the other, right? Meaning, let's say this person knew today was Shabbos and he didn't care. He was going to go, which obviously, unfortunately, is not an uncommon thing, right? Where people are Mechal Shabbos, but if it's Yom Kippur, they wouldn't do it, right? So had he known it was Yom Kippur, he wouldn't have gone and worked in his field. But he knew it was a Shabbos. He didn't remember that it was Yom Kippur, so that's considered to be a shogeg for Yom Kippur, but a mazid for Shabbat. Now, of course, you could have vice versa. I don't know. It's probably less common, where a person's like, I don't care about Yom Kippur. So he's mazed on Yom Kippur, but if he knew it was Shabbat, he wouldn't have done malacha, right? So he only did malacha on Shabbat because he forgot it was Shabbat. So basically, this person went and worked in the field. They told him before, don't work in the field. Today is Shabbat. He said, I don't care. I'm working even though it's Shabbat. But later they said, oh, and it's Yom Kippur. He said, oh, if I had known it was Yom Kippur, I would have never done it, right? Again, I don't think that's such a hard thing to imagine. People keep Yom Kippur more than Shabbat. Again, the other way, I'm not so sure, but let's just say, and for the Gemara's purposes, we just need theoretical people, right? So let's say you are shagag b'Shabbat, meaning you were shogeg b'Shabbat. You would not have you had known it was Shabbat, but you didn't care about Yom Kippur. Yom Kippurim. There you're chayav, because what this implies is that when we say you're chayav once, if you forget both, you're chayav for Shabbat, right? And so if you forget that it's Shabbat, even if you're mazing for Yom Kippur, you'd be chayav a korban for Shabbat. But if the opposite way, said Rabbi Yochanan, Hazed b'Shabbat b'Shagag b'Yom Kippurim, you'd be patur. Because even though Rabbi Yosef Glili said you're chayiv once, what he meant was you're chayiv for Shabbat. So if you come in and say, I know it's Shabbat, I don't care, I'm doing melacha anyways, and then later you say, had I known it was Yom Kippur, I wouldn't have done it. So you're a shogeg for Yom Kippur. You don't bring a karban. Because when Yosef Glili says you bring a karban, the karban is for Shabbat. The karban is not for Yom Kippur. And by Shabbat, you didn't do a mezid. You did a shogeg. You did not do a shogeg. You did a mezid, and therefore you'd be patur on a karban. So this is a very interesting
Uh,
and controversial statement, right?
Yeah, but that's the least of your problems because if you're warned and you deliberately do a Muslim Shabbat, you've just done a death penalty offense.
So
The
you are
last thing you
correct.
worry about is the carbon.
Okay, that may or may not be true. But let's say you didn't have Atraa. Let's say it was a time when they weren't killing. There's ways, there's ways around it. I agree that with God, you've got bigger problems. But you're not putter. Remember, Kimle b'derabba is not something you necessarily be putter just because a karban does you're putter from paying. You're not putter from a karban. Okay. So it says the Gemara that was Rabbi Yochanan's very interesting. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yaakov bar Guri, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, said this very interesting statement. Says in my time, right? So what's the rationale? I just explained it to you a little bit, but what's the rationale for Rabbi Yochanan's interesting statement? Says Abaya, where am I? Yep. Amar Abaya, says Abaya, well, the reason is that the main prohibition, according to Rabbi Yosef Aglili, is Shabbat. When Rabbi Yosef Aglili says you're chayiv once, he means you're chayiv once for Shabbat. Why? Because Shabbat kaviyah v'kaima. Shabbat exists, right? It's a temporary, not temporary, it's a permanent day. Every seventh day is Shabbat. I can predict 100,000 years into the future what day will be Shabbat. But Yom Kippurim bedina de kakavilai. Yom Kippur is the 10th day of Tishrei. So it's based on the kviyot of the Beit Din of Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. And so basically, we have a calendar, but still, then the Isser, the day is not called Yom Kippur until Beit Din says now is Tishrei. And since that's the second thing that comes, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the first Isur of Shabbat is the main Isur. It's the only one you're chayiv if you forget both. And if you forget just Shabbat, you'd be chayiv a karban. But if you forget just Yom Kippur and Mezin on Shabbat, you would not be chayiv a karban. Says Rava, that's ridiculous. It doesn't matter to me that now we know we have a calendar from the funeral home that next year Yom Kippur is on X and X day. When the sun sets on Friday night, Yom Kippur and Shabbos start at the same time, right? Amalei Rava, I disagree with that concept. Sof, Tervayo Bahadei Adavika Atu. They both start at the exact same time. So you're not chayiv. It's not Yom Kippur because 2 years from now, it's going to be Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur starts at Shkia or whatever time Yom Kippur starts on that Friday night. And therefore, I don't agree with you. I think that they come at the same time. And I disagree with this whole halacha that Ein Isur Chal Isur by Yom Kippur. And in fact, because Yom Kippur and Shabbos start at the same time, I think that Rabbi Yossi Aglili would admit that both Isurim fall at once. Says Gemara, okay, that's Rava's explanation. Says the Gemara, but what was Rabbi Yochanan saying? Rabbi Yochanan was saying that if you forgot Yom Kippur, you are patur from a karban, but if you forgot Shabbat, you're chayiv in a karban. Why? According to you, Rava, that both come at the same time, why don't you say that either one would be chayav? Says Elama Rava, there was a and this is a fascinating historical, I don't know if there's any, we don't necessarily have record of this, but the history that the Gemara is about to tell you is incredible, is that this actually was not a real halacha of Rabbi Yochanan that applied to regular times. It was a very specific case. It was a shmada, right? Where am I? It was a shmada havi. There was a time of persecution and terror, and I don't know how we translate shma in English, but it means all those things, right? It was a very unique and terrible time. And essentially what had happened is that the Romans, who in Rabbi Yochanan's time, and those times the Gemara controlled Israel with a very strong fist, had made a decree that people cannot keep Yom Kippur. So they made a decree that nobody is allowed to observe Yom Kippur this year. Okay. And basically what happened was, so no one could keep Yom Kippur, right? It was an Isser, you'd get killed. No one kept Yom Kippur that year. And the Chachamim were worried that because no one was going to keep Yom Kippur that year, that people were going to forget about Yom Kippur, not just that year, right? Maybe the Romans would keep this decree for 100 years. So we were worried, the Chachamim were worried that they would forget about Yom Kippur. And so they made a rule, again, all this is fascinating. They made a rule that this Shabbat, let's say called Shabbat Shuvah, right, which is right around Yom Kippur, we should observe Yom Kippur on that Shabbat. So it's crazy halacha, right? That basically you're keeping Shabbos anyways. I guess the Romans had allowed you to keep Shabbos, so you don't have to work because it's Shabbos. Observe Yom Kippur on this Shabbos. So it's the eighth day of Elul, let's say, or Tishrei, sorry. But they made a takana, observe Yom Kippur on this Shabbos because we otherwise will forget about Yom Kippur. So the next Monday, which is Yom Kippur, you have to go to work. You have to do everything regular because the Romans will kill you otherwise. But on the Shabbos before, we'll observe Yom Kippur. And so basically, it was a op now. So now, when you think about it that way, obviously the day is not really Yom Kippur, right? So if a person does malacha on that Shabbos where they're pretending it's Yom Kippur, if they forget that it's Shabbos, they bring a karban. If they forget it's Yom Kippur, they don't bring a karban because it's not Yom Kippur, right? So that explains Rabbi Yochanan's statement, right? Which again is completely out of context and you don't know what he's talking about. But basically, it was a very unique scenario. Shmadave, it was a time of persecution. V'shalchu mitam, and they sent a message, the Yoma de Kippur, the Hashata Shabtahu, that year we would observe Yom Kippur on Shabbos. Again, obviously it's not Yom Kippur, right? And so therefore the Rabbanan don't have the power. They have the power to tell you to behave this way, but not to keep it as Yom Kippur. And therefore, you obviously don't bring a karban if you are Mechal Yom Kippur when it's not Yom Kippur. And that's all Rabbi Yochanan was saying, that don't make a mistake and think, oh, we observed Yom Kippur on Shabbos last year, and therefore it means it's really Yom Kippur. It means that it's an observed Yom Kippur. It's a I don't use the word fake, but it's a ceremonial Yom Kippur, but it's obviously not a real Yom Kippur. V'chein kiata Ravin v'chol nechuti amru keravin. When Ravin came down to Bavel with all the nechuti, right? Nechuti is a very funny term. Nechut means those who descended, right? Meaning all of the refugees who came to Bavel, amru kerava, they said it like Rava, that in fact this statement of Rabbi Yochanan was not a general rule that when there's an Isser of Yom Kippur and Shabbos together, you keep Shabbos is more important, Yom Kippur is less important. Really, says Rava, they come at the same time. But this reflected a very unique and terrible situation where they couldn't keep Yom Kippur, and so they had a pseudo Yom Kippur on a different day that wasn't Yom Kippur on a Shabbos. And all Rabbi Yochanan was pointing out was that it's not a real Yom Kippur. But that is, again, a fascinating and terrifying reality of the Jews in the Roman times where these gezerot, I think, were not uncommon, right? Where they prohibited doing mitzvot and it was with death. It was not a simple thing. So
Couldn't they have jerry-rigged the calendar so that Yom Kippur fell on Shabbat with enough months' notice about when they
I mean,
declare the new
there's
moon?
limits, right? There's limits to what you can do, but I so I don't know the answer, but there are limits to what you can do. I mean, obviously you can move things a day or two, but you can't necessarily move things
Yeah.
too many, right? I mean, the calendar's the calendar. Anyways, again, it just makes you think. Well, we just had Tisha B'av, of course, but this was not unheard of at all. And so this is, I don't know if there's any
Mm.
real record like of a specific year where they said this, but there are all kinds of these decrees from the Romans. Anyways, let's finish the daf. We're two dots around 12 or so lines from the bottom. So the Mishnah continued where Amar of Yehuda, Yehuda said, I don't know what you're talking about. Why in the world would Gid Nashed not apply to a Behemat Tme'ah? It applies to Bnei Yaakov who were able to eat Behemat Tme'ah, but they couldn't eat the Gid Nashed, right? And the Chachamim answered in the Mishnah, no, it didn't apply to Bnei Yaakov. It was applied only after Har Sinai, but it was said in that place it was
Mhm.
put into context. Tanya. Now says the Braita, when we elaborate on this discussion of Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan, Amrullah Rabbi Yehuda, the Chachamim said back to Rabbi Yehuda, what do you think? You really think that Bnei Yaakov were not allowed to eat the Gid Nasheh? That Reuven and Shimon couldn't eat Gid Nasheh? V'chi Nemar. Does it say in the pasuk, Al Kain lo Yechlu Bnei Yaakov et Gid Nasheh? It doesn't say Bnei Yaakov, Alolo Nemar Bnei Yisrael. It says the Bnei Yisrael. Now, Bnei Yisrael was not the term we used to call the children of Yaakov. It was the term we used for the peoplehood of Bnei Yisrael. V'lo Nikru Bnei Yisrael ad Sinai. They weren't called as a community, as a nation, Bnei Yisrael until Har Sinai. Ella b'Sinai Namar must be that this halacha was said at Har Sinai, and there wasn't a prohibition of Gid Nasheh until Har Sinai. Ella shnichtav b'mekomo leida me'ezatam nesar lehem. It was written in context so you understand the reason for Gid Nasheh because of Yaakov and the fight with the messenger. Okay, so that is what the Rabbanan said back to Rabbi Yehuda in the Braita, which elaborates on the Mishnah, and it's basically based on the word Bnei Yisrael instead of Bnei Yaakov. Okay, so that is the Mishnah. Um, says Rava, Mativ Rava. Says Rava, what are you talking about? What do you mean they were never called Bnei Yaakov in the life of Yaakov? It says in a pasuk, "Vayisu Bnei Yisrael et Yaakov Avihem," right? That Bnei Yisrael took their father. This is talking when they went down to Egypt, right? Yaakov Beersheva. I'm reading. I have the psukim in my fancy Gemara online. Vayisu Bnei Yisrael et Yaakov Avihem. That Tapam et Shehem Bagalot that Paro had sent. So you see that they were called Bnei Yisrael even in the time of the life of Yaakov, even before Har Sinai, right? Says Gemara, so Matav Rava b'Yisub b'nei Yisrael Yaakov Aviyam says, answers the Gemara, well, you're right that they were called Bnei Yisrael, but they were called Bnei Yisrael. That was years later, right? This was when 40 years later, after the children had grown and they'd gone down to Egypt and there was a famine, they were only called that La'achar Ma'aseh. It was only after the fact, but at the time of the Gid HaNasheh, they were never called Bnei Yisrael. Amalei Ravacha B'nei Rav Ravashi says Rav Ravashi. Okay, well, let's say from that moment, the Torah said Bnei Yisrael don't eat Gid HaNasheh. Now you're calling them Bnei Yisrael. They have identity as Bnei Yisrael. Mehi Shaita Litzar. Let them become Asur at that time, well before Matan Torah, when they're called Bnei Yisrael. He said to them, that's ridiculous. Are you saying that the Torah is given at over and over and over again, which is what I would think it would mean? That time was not the time that it happened, and it was not the time of Matan Torah, right? Meaning the at the time that it happened, the Torah says, Lo yuchlu b'nei Yisrael. They were not yet called Bnei Yisrael. So clearly the Avera or the prohibition of Gid HaNasheh could not be chal on them at that moment. When is it chal? When the Torah is given again in Har Sinai. The Torah is given again. The Torah is given for the first time in Har Sinai. It's not like every minute you wake up that morning and say, are they called Bnei Yisrael today? Are they called Bnei Yisrael today? They weren't Bnei Yisrael at that time. And so clearly when the Torah says to Bnei Yisrael, it's referring to the people who will later be called Bnei Yisrael in Har Sinai. And so that is the Chachamim's response to Rabbi Yehuda. We have a few more minutes. Let's maybe start the next sugya. It's just the beginning, but no one's running anywhere, right? Okay, so let's do a few lines. I'm trying to think about where we're going to start. We'll figure out how to stop. Tanu Rabbanan, says the Braita, Aver Minachai, right? Now, this is what Charlie asked about yesterday, so we actually get to it. Aver Minachai, which we mentioned yesterday, applies to maybe you didn't raise this yesterday. Sorry, I made a mistake. Aver Minachai, we're going to see why we're getting to Aver Minachai, because although it's different, of course, than Gid HaNasheh, I thought of it because it also applies to Bnei Noach. But the reason we're actually talking about it is because we're going to have a machloket, Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, that's very similar to the machloket we just had about Gid HaNasheh, right? So we have a prohibition that you can't eat a limb from an animal that was taken off when it was alive, right? You cut off a limb or a limb falls off, you can't then eat that. That's called Aver Minachai. Says the Braita, Aver Minachai noeg bebehema chaya ve'of. It applies to all species, right? Domesticated animals, wild animals, birds, bein tmeim, bein tahorim, whether they are kosher species or non-kosher species. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Elazar, right? It says Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Elazar. The Chachamim omrim eino noheg ela b'tahorim. The whole prohibition of Aver Minachai only applies to kosher animals. So the whole concept of Aver Minachai, which is an issur for us and for Bnei Noach, we'll get to this, is only true about animals that you otherwise could eat, but if you take the aver off it while it's alive, you're not allowed to eat it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Yochanan, this machloket Tanaim is based on the same pasuk. They're not coming from different sources. Shneim nikra echad darshu. They both darshan, both the Tanaim, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar, and the Chachamim darshan the same pasuk. Because the pasuk says, where am I? The pasuk says, this is in Ekev, right? Rak chazak devilti achol hadam. Be careful, don't eat the blood of an animal. Ki hadam hu hanafesh. The blood is the nefesh, and turn to daf kuf bed. Lo tochal hanefesh im habasar. And this is where we learn, we're going to get to in a little bit, that you're not allowed to eat the nefesh with the meat. So don't eat meat that is still alive, basically. Okay? So that is the source for Aver Minachai, or let's say one of the sources, but that's the source for Aver Minachai. Okay, because you can't eat meat that still has its nefesh with it. So how does that teach you kosher or non-kosher animal? So Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar Savri, look, anything, kosher atam mitzaveh al damo, atam mitzaveh al ivarav. Right? The pasuk connects. The first part says don't eat blood. The second part is don't eat meat that still has its blood in it, which we understand to mean has not been shechted or killed. Right? So Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Yehuda say, look, just like blood is a problem, Avram and Achai is a problem. Hani Tzmeim Nami, animals that are not kosher, Ho Vata Mitzuvah Al Daman, since everybody agrees, and we can talk later as we get there how we know this, that you're not allowed to eat the blood of those animals, then the same thing would be true about the limb from that animal that is fell off when it's alive. But Rabbanan say, no. The way you read the pasuk of Lo Tochal HaNefesh Im HaBasar is don't eat the nefesh with the meat, right? Meaning, Ela Basar L'chudei, but if you had the basar alone, meaning the nefesh was not with that basar because you had killed the animal or shechted the animal, you're allowed to eat it. Anything where the meat would be mutar if it was shechted properly, there's a prohibition of aver that was minachai. Anything where you couldn't eat the basar because it's not a kosher animal, there's no prohibition of aver minachai, right?
So that would apply to a treifa.
You mean aver minachai from a treifa?
Yeah.
You mean if the aver came off before it became a treifa? So at that time it was.
Now after it became
Well, then it's not aver minachai if the animal. Oh, you mean if the animal's a treifa? You're correct. Okay, yes, that would apply. Sorry, I don't know why I missed that. Yes, would apply if the animal was a treifa at the time that the aver fell off. It wouldn't have an according to this, it wouldn't have an isra aver minachai. Correct.
Okay.
Asking, I'm doing two more lines. One more line. Rabbi Yehuda Lamali Cross. This is where on just the end of today's daf, because this is our whole sugya. Why does Rabbi Yehuda need a pasuk to tell you that Aver Minachai applies to Behemat Tmeya? Why don't you just say that it's an Isser Chal Isser, right? Leiti Isser Aver, Leichal Isser Tuma. The animal was born as a lion. It's an Isser Tuma. But the Isser Aver Minachai should come the same way the Isser Gidan Nasheh came. Shekain Isuro Noheg B'Bnei Noach. Exactly the same thing. Right? We said yesterday, and I repeated it today, that Rabbi Yehuda holds you chayiv twice for Gidan Nasheh and a Behemat Tmeya, because you start with Behemat Tmeya, you add an Isser of Gidan Nasheh. Why don't you say the exact same thing about Aver Minachai? And so, of course you would. Einachinami. That, in fact, is true. The pasuk is for Rebbe Elazar. The Rebbe Elazar. You need the pasuk only for Rebbe Elazar, who is not Rebbe Yehuda and presumably disagrees with him, and that's why the mission, the Braita had the pasuk. And I'm going to stop here because otherwise we'll just keep going and going and going. I know Nav has a big audience that wants to keep learning, but we're going to have to pick it up tomorrow. So we're going to stop at Tanya Nami Hachi and continue Aver Menachai in tomorrow's daf. Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov, Yasher Koach.
Thank you.
Shavua Tov.
Hi, Joseph and Allegra.
Say hi. Hi.
Okay, bye, guys.